The sky above central Texas on the morning of May 27, 1997, was the color of old silver, a dull, heavy sheen that seemed to press down on the land. The air was thick and still, a warm, wet blanket that clung to everything it touched. In the small town of Jrell, Texas, the day began like any other. People woke up, brewed coffee, and headed out to tend to their chores. Jrell was a quiet place, a community of about 400 souls, nestled in the rolling hills of Williamson County about 30 miles north of Austin. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the high school football games were the biggest event of the week, and where the biggest worry was usually the price of hay or the health of the cattle. The land was wide and open, fields of corn and wheat stretching out to the horizon, broken only by the occasional stand of live oak or a cluster of mobile homes. It was a simple, hardworking place, and the people who lived there were proud of that. But on that Tuesday morning, there was a sense of unease in the air. The weather forecasters had been talking about a dangerous setup for days. A massive low-pressure system was pushing up from the Gulf of Mexico, dragging a river of warm, moist air across the Texas plains. That sticky tropical air was colliding with a cold front sweeping down from the north, creating a recipe for explosive storms. The National Weather Service had issued a severe weather outlook, warning that the conditions were ripe for large hail, damaging winds, and the possibility of strong tornadoes. The people of central Texas were used to spring storms. They knew how to read the sky, but even the most seasoned storm watchers would say later that this day felt different. There was a tension in the atmosphere, a pressure in the ears, a feeling that something big was building, something that had not been seen in these parts for a very long time. By late morning, the first storms began to form. They erupted over the hill country west of Jrell like towers of white and gray, climbing high into the sky. They grew fast, boiling upward with an almost angry energy. These were supercell thunderstorms, the most powerful and dangerous kind. They have a rotating updraft, a mesocyclone that can spin up a tornado. The storm that was destined for Jrell started near the town of Brady, Texas around 1 in the afternoon. It drifted southeast, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Meteorologists watched it on radar, their voices tightening as they saw the telltale hook echo, the distinctive shape that signals a tornado on the ground. They issued warnings, urgent broadcasts on radio and television, telling people in the path to take cover. The town of Jrell was directly in the line of fire. At around 3:15 p.m., the storm reached the outskirts of the community. The sky turned a sickly green, the color of old brews. The wind picked up not in gusts but in a steady, eerie increase, a deep moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then the hail began. It started as small pellets the size of peas but quickly grew. Soon, stones the size of golf balls, then baseballs, were hammering down, pounding roofs and cars, shattering windows. The sound was deafening, a constant, rolling drumbeat of destruction. People in their homes looked out and saw a wall of white, not snow but ice, covering the ground in a matter of minutes. The hail was a warning, a herald of something far worse. And then the tornado formed. It touched down about a mile and a half west of the town center on the farmlands near the intersection of Farm to Market Road 487 and County Road 3. It did not start as a thin rope like many tornadoes do. It was already wide, already violent, a dark, churning mass of cloud and debris. It was a wedge tornado, so wide that it looked more like a bank of black fog than a funnel. It was massive, over a mile across at its widest point. And it was moving, but not with the usual swift, skipping pace of many twisters. This tornado was crawling. It was moving at a speed of roughly 5 to 10 miles per hour, barely faster than a person could walk. For something so powerful to move so slowly was almost unheard of. It meant that the destruction would be concentrated, grinding, and absolute. Instead of passing over a home in a few seconds, the tornado would sit on top of it for minutes, tearing it apart piece by piece, splinter by splinter. The people of Jrell did not have much time. The warning had come, but for some, it was too late to reach a shelter. Many homes in the area did not have basements. The limestone bedrock made them difficult and expensive to build. People did what they could. They huddled in interior bathrooms, in closets, under mattresses. They prayed. The roar of the tornado grew louder as it approached, a sound that survivors described as a freight train, but deeper, more terrible, a constant, grinding rumble that vibrated through the ground and into the bones. It was the sound of the end of the world. The first place the tornado hit was the Double Creek Estates subdivision, a neighborhood of about 30 homes, mainly modular houses and mobile homes built on the low, rolling hills. These were the homes of working families, people who had come to Jrell for the quiet life, for the affordable land. There was a woman named Joan who was home with her 2 young children. She heard the roar and grabbed her kids, rushing to the bathroom. She shut the door and they huddled together in the bathtub, covering themselves with pillows. The tornado bore down on them. The house began to shake, then to groan. The windows exploded inward and the walls started to flex. Joan held her children close, telling them it would be okay, even as she felt the world around her disintegrating. The roof lifted off and the walls peeled away like the skin of an orange. The bathtub they were in was ripped from the floor and tumbled across the yard. Joan was thrown clear, her children torn from her arms. She landed in a field, dazed and bleeding. She looked for her children. She found one, then the other. They did not survive. That scene of devastation was multiplied dozens of times over in the next few minutes. The tornado moved through Double Creek estates with a methodical cruelty. It did not just damage the homes, it erased them. The frames of the houses were disassembled, the wood splintered into toothpicks, the metal twisted into impossible shapes. The tornado was rated an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest possible rating, with winds estimated at over 300 miles per hour. At that speed, the air itself becomes a weapon. It drives debris through concrete walls, strips the bark from trees, and scours the ground down to the bare earth. In Jrell, the tornado did all of this and more. It picked up cars and trucks and tossed them into fields like toys. It tore the pavement from roads. It ripped the grass from the soil, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. One survivor, a man named Randy, was working in a metal building on his property when the storm hit. He saw the tornado coming and ran inside his house, a sturdy brick home. He got into the hallway and lay flat on the floor, covering his head. The house was a solid structure built with care. The tornado came over it and the whole building began to shake violently. Randy felt the house shift, felt the foundation lifting up. The bricks began to disintegrate around him. He watched as the walls crumbled, the roof vanished, and the floor beneath him tore apart. He was left lying on a small patch of concrete, the only remnant of his home, staring up at the churning black sky. The tornado had passed. He was alive, but everything else was gone. The tornado continued its slow, deadly crawl to the east. It crossed Farm to Market Road 487, turning vehicles into wreckage. It hit a small shopping center, flattening a grocery store and a hardware store. The debris field was enormous, stretching for miles. Pieces of houses, clothing, photographs, and personal belongings were found days later, scattered across the countryside. The tornado moved so slowly that it had time to lift debris high into the atmosphere and drop it far away. Some items were found over 60 miles away. The storm was not just destroying homes, it was scattering the lives of the people who lived there across the state of Texas. Inside the tornado itself, the forces were beyond comprehension. The pressure drop was so extreme that buildings would literally explode as the storm passed over them, the air rushing out of the structure as the external pressure vanished. The winds were so strong that they drove nails through steel beams and pieces of straw were embedded into telephone poles like needles. The tornado created its own weather, its own lightning, its own eerie glow. The power grid was obliterated. The roar drowned out every other sound. It was a moment of pure chaos, a slice of raw nature that had no regard for the human lives in its path. As the tornado pushed into the more densely populated parts of Jrell, the death toll began to climb. First responders, those who were able, began to move toward the storm even as it was still raging. They came from neighboring towns, from volunteer fire departments, from the county sheriff's office. They drove into the maelstrom, not knowing what they would find. The scene that greeted them was one of total devastation. There were no roads, no landmarks, no recognizable buildings. The ground was covered in debris, a thick layer of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shredded belongings. The air was filled with dust and the smell of natural gas from ruptured lines, and there were bodies. Some were found in the rubble, some were found in fields far from any home. The rescuers worked with grim determination, digging through the wreckage with their bare hands, listening for any sound of life. The tornado finally lifted, or dissipated, about 15 minutes after it had first touched down. It had traveled a path of roughly 7 miles, but because it moved so slowly, its impact was concentrated in a narrow corridor. The damage was not spread out, it was focused, and it was absolute. When the sun came out and the dust settled, the people of Jrell emerged from their shelters to find a world that had been completely remade. The sky was a clear, innocent blue as if nothing had happened, but the ground was a wasteland. The Double Creek Estate subdivision was gone, not just damaged, but gone. Where 30 homes had stood, there was only bare earth and scattered debris. The trees that had lined the streets were stripped of their bark and splintered into jagged stumps. The cars were crumpled into balls. It looked like a bomb had gone off. In the immediate aftermath, the search and rescue efforts began in earnest. The Red Cross set up a shelter. The National Guard was called in to secure the area. Neighbors helped neighbors, digging through the rubble of homes that were no longer there. The death toll was staggering. 27 people lost their lives in the Jarrell Tornado. 27 souls from a community of 400. That is a terrible percentage, a wound that would never fully heal. The youngest victim was a 9-month-old baby. The oldest was a 68-year-old man. Entire families were wiped out. The Sellers family, who lived in Double Creek Estates, lost 5 members, 3 generations, all gone in a single stroke of the storm. The Mohel family, who had lived in the same subdivision, lost 6. The stories of survival were just as harrowing. There was a young boy named Brian who was thrown from his home and landed in a field. He was covered in cuts and bruises, but he was alive. He walked through the debris looking for his parents. He found his mother unconscious but breathing. He found his father, who had been impaled by a piece of wood but who would also survive. Brian did not cry. He just kept walking, kept searching, kept hoping. The human spirit is resilient even when faced with the unimaginable. As the sun set on May 27, 1997, the town of Jrell was a place of shattered homes, shattered lives, and shattered hearts. But it was also a place of quiet heroism, of neighbors helping neighbors, of people refusing to give up. The storm had taken so much, but it had not taken everything. The sun set over Jarrell that evening, casting long shadows across a landscape that no longer resembled anything familiar. The rescue workers did not stop when darkness fell. They worked by flashlight, by headlights, by the glow of emergency vehicles, digging through piles of splintered wood and twisted metal, calling out names into the silence. Every so often, a shout would go up, and a team would converge, pulling debris away to reveal a survivor or worse, a body. The process was meticulous, heartbreaking, and slow. The medical examiner's office set up a temporary morgue in a nearby school gymnasium. Families gathered there waiting for news, hoping against hope. Some received the news they dreaded. Others waited days, uncertain, clinging to a thread of possibility that grew thinner with each passing hour. In the days that followed, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. 27 dead was the official count, but the number did not capture the depth of the loss. Each victim had a name, a face, a story. There was Lisa, a mother of 2 who had just moved into Double Creek Estates a month before. She was 32 years old. There was James, a retired farmer who had spent his life working the land around Jrell. He was 68. There was little Emily, who was 9 months old, whose parents had planned to take her to the zoo the following weekend. The community mourned them all, and the mourning would not be brief. The National Guard established a perimeter around the hardest-hit areas. Looters, though rare, were a concern, so armed guards patrolled the debris fields. The Federal Emergency Management Agency arrived, setting up a field office in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Officials walked through the ruins, taking notes, shaking their heads. They had seen tornado damage before, but nothing like this. The sheer intensity of the destruction was almost beyond belief. One FEMA inspector later said that the Jarrell Tornado was the most violent he had ever documented. He had been to Oklahoma City after the 1993 storm, to Alabama after the Palm Sunday tornadoes, but Jarrell was different. It was as if the tornado had not just destroyed buildings, it had destroyed the very surface of the earth. The meteorologists who studied the storm were equally awed. The tornado had formed from a supercell that had been nearly stationary for hours. The atmospheric conditions were perfect. A warm, moist air mass from the Gulf of Mexico collided with a dry line from the west, creating an unstable environment. The wind shear was extreme, with winds shifting direction and speed at different altitudes, causing the air to rotate. The storm that produced the Jarrell Tornado was a classic supercell, but it had one unusual feature. It moved very slowly, at times almost not moving at all. This allowed the tornado to remain in one place for an extended period, pulverizing everything in its path. The rating of F5 was based on the damage, but the winds were estimated to be well over 300 miles per hour, perhaps as high as 350. At those speeds, the air itself becomes a fluid that can tear steel beams, lift concrete slabs, and strip the paint from cars. The aftermath brought a wave of scientists and storm chasers to Jrell. They came to study the damage patterns, to measure the debris field, to understand how such a storm could have been so destructive. They walked the streets that were no longer streets, measuring the distance objects had been thrown, analyzing the way the ground had been scoured. They found that the tornado had carved a trench in the earth, in some places as deep as 2 feet, where the soil had been completely removed. They found evidence of extreme hydrostatic pressure. The rapid pressure drop inside the tornado had caused buildings to explode outward, not inward. The victims had not been crushed, they had been blown apart. The findings would later be used to improve building codes and warning systems, but for the people of Jrell, that knowledge came too late. The recovery effort was a massive undertaking. Volunteers poured in from across Texas and beyond. They came with chainsaws and shovels, with food and water, with compassion and determination. They worked alongside professional search and rescue teams, sifting through the wreckage with their hands. They found photographs, wedding rings, children's toys. They found a Bible that had survived intact, lying open on a patch of bare ground. They found a stuffed bear that belonged to a little girl who had not made it. The volunteers created a collection point for personal belongings, hoping that some could be returned to the families. It became a makeshift memorial, a place where people came to remember what they had lost. The first funerals were held 3 days after the storm. The town of Jrell did not have a funeral home large enough to accommodate the number of services, so the church on Main Street became a gathering place. The church had been spared by the tornado, though its windows had been blown out and its roof damaged. The pastor, a man named John, had lost his own home, but he stood in the pulpit consoling his congregation, reading from the book of Job. He spoke of faith in the face of suffering, of the mystery of God's will, of the need to hold on to one another. Many wept, many held hands. The hymns that were sung that day echoed through the small town, carrying a message of hope that felt fragile but real. In the weeks and months that followed, the people of Jrell began the slow work of rebuilding. The federal government provided low-interest loans and grants. Insurance companies, though overwhelmed, began processing claims. Architects and engineers came to advise on new construction standards, reinforced concrete, storm shelters, impact-resistant windows. The town council voted to require safe rooms in all new homes, a decision that would save lives in future storms. The Double Creek Estate subdivision was never rebuilt. The land was left fallow, a grassy field where wildflowers bloom in spring, a quiet memorial to those who had died. Survivors of the tornado carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress, from nightmares, from a persistent anxiety that would never fully fade. They would flinch at the sound of thunder, at the sight of dark clouds on the horizon. They would check the weather obsessively, watching the radar, tracking every storm cell that formed. They would develop rituals like always having a flashlight and a radio within reach, or keeping a pair of sturdy shoes by the bed. The tornado had taught them that safety was an illusion, that the world could change in an instant. But it had also taught them that they were stronger than they knew. They had survived the worst that nature could throw at them, and they had not given up. One survivor, a woman named Helen, wrote a memoir about her experience. She described the moments before the tornado hit, the green sky, the roar, the sudden silence when the power went out. She described the feeling of being lifted from the bathtub, of flying through the air, of landing in a field of mud. She described waking up in a hospital, her body covered in bandages, the doctor telling her that her husband and children were alive. She wrote about the long recovery, the physical therapy, the counseling sessions. She wrote about the community that had surrounded her, the strangers who brought meals, the friends who held her hand. Her book became a bestseller in Texas, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The Jarrell Tornado also had a profound impact on meteorology. It became a case study for how to issue warnings for slow-moving supercells, for how to communicate the danger of tornadoes that do not seem to be moving. The National Weather Service re-examined its protocols, improving the way it described the potential for violent tornadoes. The storm also highlighted the importance of storm shelters in tornado-prone areas. After Jrell, many communities in Texas and across the plains began to mandate safe rooms in new construction. The tornado, in a cruel irony, had saved lives that would be lost in future storms. The legacy of the Jarrell Tornado is one of loss, but also of learning. It is a story of a small town that faced an unimaginable disaster and refused to be broken. It is a story of people who, in the midst of tragedy, found the strength to help one another, to rebuild, to remember. The scars are still there, hidden beneath the new homes, the paved streets, the quiet fields. But so is the spirit. The town of Jrell continues to live, continues to grow, continues to honor the memory of the 27 who were taken. Every year on the anniversary of the storm, the church bell tolls 27 times. The survivors gather, the children of survivors come, and they stand in silence, looking out at the sky, grateful for the time they have. The tornado of May 27, 1997, is a date that will never be forgotten. It is a part of their identity, a chapter in their history, a reminder that the forces of nature are powerful, but the bonds of community are stronger. And that is the lesson of Jrell: even when the world comes apart, people come together. And that is the lesson of Jrell: even when the world comes apart, people come together. But what does that togetherness look like when the cameras leave and the volunteers go home? What happens when the first anniversary comes, and the second, and the 10th, and the 25th? The story of Jrell did not end with the rebuilding of homes or the ringing of church bells. It continued in the quiet moments, in the private grief, in the slow process of learning to live with the memory of what had happened. Consider the story of the Martinez family. They had moved to Double Creek Estates just a year before the tornado. Carlos Martinez worked as a mechanic at a shop in Georgetown. His wife Alina stayed home with their 2 young children, a boy named Gabriel and a girl named Sophia. On the afternoon of May 27th, Alina had been watching the weather. She had seen the dark sky, had heard the warning sirens from the town. She had gathered the children into the interior bathroom, the one with no windows. She had covered them with blankets, had held them close, had whispered prayers in Spanish. When the tornado struck, it tore the bathroom off its foundation. Alina held onto Gabriel and Sophia with all her strength, but the wind was too powerful. She was lifted, twisted, thrown. She landed in a field a quarter-mile away, her arm broken, her ribs fractured. She crawled through the debris, calling for her children. She found Gabriel first, unconscious but breathing. She found Sophia next, lying in a patch of grass, her body still. Sophia was 5 years old. She had been killed by a piece of flying lumber. Carlos was at work when the storm hit. He heard the news on the radio, drove home through the rain and the chaos. He found Alina in a makeshift triage center set up in the high school gymnasium. She was covered in blood, her arm in a sling, her eyes wild. She told him about Sophia. Carlos collapsed. For days, he did not speak. He sat in the ruins of their home, sifting through the wreckage, looking for anything that belonged to his daughter. He found her favorite doll, a Raggedy Ann with red yarn hair. He found her crayon drawings, some of them still pinned to a piece of wall that had survived. He found a small shoe. He held these things in his hands and wept. The Martinez family did not leave Jrell. They could not afford to move and they did not want to. This was their home. They stayed in a temporary trailer provided by FEMA while their house was rebuilt. Carlos went back to work at the garage. Alina went to therapy. They had Gabriel to care for and they poured all their love into him, but the grief never left. It was a shadow that followed them from room to room. On Sophia's birthday each year, they released balloons into the sky, watching them drift until they became specks, then disappeared. They visited the memorial at Double Creek Estates, the field where wildflowers grew, and they laid flowers of their own. Gabriel grew up with the tornado as a part of his identity. He was only 4 years old when it happened, but he remembered fragments, the sound of the wind, the feeling of being squeezed, the sight of his sister's face in the field. He had nightmares for years. He would wake up screaming and his mother would hold him, rocking him back to sleep. As a teenager, Gabriel became fascinated with weather. He studied meteorology in college, learned to read radar images, understood the dynamics of supercells and mesocyclones. He wanted to understand what had happened that day to make sense of the senseless. He became a storm chaser himself, not for the thrill but for the purpose. He wanted to document storms to help forecasters issue better warnings, to maybe save a family like his own from ever having to experience what he had experienced. Gabriel's story is just one of many. The tornado created a ripple effect that touched everyone who survived. There was the elderly couple, the Hendersons, who had lived in Jrell for 40 years. They lost their house, their car, their dog. They had no children, no close relatives. They were alone in the aftermath, but the community did not let them stay alone. Neighbors brought them meals, drove them to appointments, helped them fill out insurance forms. The Hendersons rebuilt their home on the same lot, but they never felt safe again. They installed a storm shelter in the backyard, a steel bunker that could withstand an F5. They went into it every time a thunderstorm was predicted, even if the chance of a tornado was low. They grew accustomed to the smell of concrete, the sound of rain on the metal hatch. They kept a battery-powered radio, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a bottle of water. They were prepared, but preparation did not erase the fear. The fear became a part of them like a chronic ache. Then there were the first responders. The firefighters from the Jarrell Volunteer Fire Department were among the first to arrive on the scene. They had never seen anything like it. They had trained for structure fires, for car accidents, for medical emergencies. They had not trained for this. The chief, a man named Dale Wilkins, recalled walking through Double Creek Estates and not recognizing it. The streets were gone. The houses were piles of splinters. The bodies were scattered like ragdolls. He and his crew worked for 36 hours straight, without sleep, without rest. They dug through debris with their hands, with shovels, with whatever tools they could find. They found survivors. They found the dead. They brought people to safety and they carried out the ones who had not made it. After the recovery effort was over, Dale Wilkins did not sleep well for months. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, seeing the images again. He went to counseling, but the images never fully went away. He retired early, unable to face the thought of another disaster. The Jarrell tornado also changed the way the National Weather Service communicated warnings. Before 1997, warnings were often generic, telling people that a tornado had been spotted and to take cover. But the Jarrell storm showed that the location of the tornado was not enough. People needed to know the intensity, the direction, the speed, the potential for violence. They needed to know that a tornado could be nearly stationary, that it could sit on one spot for minutes, that it could grind a neighborhood into dust. After Jarrell, the Weather Service began using more specific language, like this is a particularly dangerous situation and you are in the path of a violent tornado. They began to emphasize that if you are in a mobile home or a car, you need to get to a sturdy shelter immediately, that there is no safe place above ground. The warnings became more urgent, more vivid. They saved lives in later storms, like the Moore tornado of 1999 and the Joplin tornado of 2001. The scientific community also learned from Jarrell. Meteorologists had known about the concept of a stalling supercell, but they had never seen one produce such extreme damage. The tornado had been so slow that it had essentially scoured the Earth, creating damage that was off the charts. This led to a rethinking of how tornadoes are rated. The Fujita scale, which had been developed in 1971, was based on damage, but it was subjective and inconsistent. After Jrell, researchers began to develop the enhanced Fujita scale, which was implemented in 20 The EF scale used more detailed damage indicators, linking wind speeds to specific types of damage to buildings, trees, and infrastructure. It provided a more accurate assessment of tornado intensity, but the lessons went beyond scales. Scientists studied the radar data from Jarrell, the way the mesocyclone had tightened, the way the rear flank downdraft had wrapped around the circulation. They created computer models that simulated the storm, trying to understand why it had stalled. They discovered that the storm was being influenced by a complex interaction of winds at different levels of the atmosphere, a kind of atmospheric traffic jam that had pinned the storm in place. Over the years, the town of Jrell continued to evolve. New families moved in, attracted by the low cost of living and the small-town atmosphere. Some of them did not know about the tornado, or they had heard the story but did not dwell on it. For them, Jrell was just a place to live, a quiet community on the edge of the Texas hill country. But for the old-timers, for the survivors, the memory was always there. They would see a new neighbor building a house and wonder if they had installed a safe room. They would hear a siren test on Wednesday and flinch. They would look at the sky on a spring afternoon and feel a knot in their stomach. They developed a kind of vigilance that never relaxed. They knew that the atmosphere could turn violent in a matter of minutes, that the green sky could appear, that the roar could begin. The annual memorial service on May 27th became a tradition. At first, it was a small gathering at the church, with the pastor reading the names of the 27. Over time, it grew. The town erected a permanent monument in the park near City Hall, a granite obelisk with the names engraved in gold. Families would come and leave flowers, photos, small toys. Sometimes strangers would stop by, people who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. The memorial became a place of reflection, a place to teach children about the power of nature and the strength of community. School field trips would visit and a survivor would speak, telling the story of what happened. The children would listen wide-eyed and then they would go back to class and write essays about the tornado. They would draw pictures of swirling clouds and houses being lifted. The story was passed down generation to generation, becoming a part of the town's folklore. But for some, the memorial was too painful. They could not bear to hear the names read aloud. They stayed away. They spent the anniversary in private, in their homes, in their safe rooms, in the quiet of their own grief. They did not need a ceremony to remember. They remembered every day. They remembered the sound of the wind, the smell of the mud, the feeling of the ground shaking. They remembered the faces of the people they had lost. They carried those memories with them like stones in their pockets, heavy and worn smooth by time. One of the most difficult aspects of the aftermath was the media attention. For weeks after the tornado, journalists descended on Jrell. They interviewed survivors, took pictures of the devastation, broadcast the images across the country. Some families welcomed the attention, wanting to tell their stories, wanting the world to know what had happened. Others felt exploited. They felt that the reporters were intruding on their grief, turning their tragedy into a spectacle. A few survivors became spokespersons, appearing on news programs and documentaries, giving talks about preparedness. Others retreated into silence, refusing to speak to the media again. The tension between the desire to share and the need to protect was never fully resolved. The town itself had to deal with a new kind of scrutiny. People from outside would come to gawk, to drive through Double Creek estates and stare at the empty field. Some were respectful. Some were not. There were rumors of people stealing souvenirs from the debris, pieces of wood, nails, broken glass. The town council eventually put up a fence around the field with a sign that read, "This area is a memorial, please show respect." It helped, but only a little. The curious kept coming and the survivors kept watching, their patience worn thin by years of being a cautionary tale. In the end, the Jarrell tornado became more than a natural disaster. It became a symbol. For meteorologists, it was a warning about the dangers of slow-moving supercells. For emergency managers, it was a case study in the importance of safe rooms and community preparedness. For the public, it was a reminder that tornadoes could be unpredictable, violent, and merciless. But for the people of Jrell, it was their home, their loss, their healing. They did not want to be defined by the tornado, but they could not escape it. It was written into the landscape, into the memories, into the fabric of the town. As the years passed, the survivors found ways to cope. Some wrote books like Helen. Some became activists, pushing for better building codes and more funding for storm research. Some simply lived their lives, raising their children, working their jobs, tending their gardens. They learned to live with the fear, to manage it, to not let it consume them. They learned that grief does not have a timeline, that it comes and goes in waves, that sometimes it crashes over you unexpectedly. They learned to lean on each other, to check in on their neighbors, to be there for the new families who moved in and did not know what to expect when the sky turned green. And the sky still turns green every spring, every May. The storms come, the warnings blare, the sirens sound. But now the people of Jrell are ready. They have their safe rooms, they have their plans, they have their community. They know that the tornado could come again, but they also know that they can face it together. They have been through the worst and they are still standing. That is the legacy of May 27, 1997. That is the story of Jrell, but the story does not end there. The legacy of the Jarrell tornado ripples outward, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of Williamson County. In the years that followed, the storm became a touchstone for a generation of atmospheric scientists, a case study that challenged their assumptions about what a tornado could do. It forced them to look at the mechanics of a supercell with new eyes, to ask questions they had not thought to ask before. How does a storm become stationary? What conditions allow a mesocyclone to tighten and descend so slowly that it pulverizes everything in its path? These questions led to deeper investigations into the role of outflow boundaries, the interaction between the rear flank downdraft and the forward flank downdraft, the subtle changes in wind shear that can stall a storm. Research teams from the National Severe Storms Laboratory and the Storm Prediction Center devoted months to analyzing the Jarrell data, using it to refine their computer models to improve their forecasting techniques. They discovered that the storm had been feeding on an extraordinarily unstable atmosphere, with dew points in the mid-70s and a cap that broke violently. The environment was so ripe that once the storm started spinning, it simply would not move. It anchored itself to a thermal boundary, drawing moisture and energy from the same patch of ground for hours. That kind of persistence was rare, but it was not unique. After Jrell, forecasters began to pay closer attention to storms that appeared to be slowing down, especially in the warm sector of a low-pressure system. They developed new algorithms to detect the potential for prolonged tornado formation, algorithms that would later be incorporated into the warning decision support system used by National Weather Service offices across the country. The impact on emergency management was equally profound. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, took note of the fact that not a single death occurred in a residence with a safe room. That simple statistic became a rallying cry for a national campaign to promote safe room construction. FEMA published guidelines for building in-residence shelters, offering technical assistance to homeowners and contractors. The agency also provided funding for community safe rooms in tornado-prone areas, a program that expanded significantly after Jrell. States like Oklahoma, Kansas, and Alabama began to adopt building codes that required new homes in high-risk zones to include a reinforced interior room or a concrete shelter. The movement gained momentum after the Moore tornado of 1999 and the Tuscaloosa tornado of 2011, but the seed was planted in Jrell. The town itself became a model for disaster recovery and mitigation. The Federal Emergency Management Agency used Jrell as a case study in its training courses for emergency managers, showing how a small community could rebuild with resilience in mind. The new Double Creek Estates, when it was eventually rebuilt, featured homes with reinforced roofs and impact-resistant windows. Some homeowners installed underground shelters, buried in their backyards, with steel doors and ventilation systems. Others opted for above-ground safe rooms made of poured concrete, built into the garage or the master closet. The local hardware store began stocking the rebar, and the concrete forms needed for these projects, and business boomed. The town's building inspector became an expert on safe room construction, traveling to neighboring counties to give talks. He would tell audiences that a safe room was not a luxury, that it was the difference between life and death, that he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The psychological toll of the tornado also inspired new research. Psychologists and sociologists descended on Jrell to study the long-term effects of trauma on a small community. They interviewed survivors, conducted surveys, measured rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. What they found was sobering. Many survivors continued to experience severe symptoms years after the event. They had nightmares, flashbacks, a hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax. Some developed phobias of storms, of darkness, of the color green. Others struggled with survivors' guilt, asking themselves why they had lived when their neighbors had died. The children were particularly affected. They had grown up in a world where the sky could turn deadly, where their parents had taught them to be afraid. Some coped by becoming obsessed with weather, learning the names of clouds, tracking storms online. Others refused to talk about the tornado at all, burying the memory so deep that it resurfaced in unexpected ways. The research led to the development of new mental health interventions for disaster survivors, including community-based support groups, school counseling programs, and mobile crisis units. The Red Cross and other organizations began to integrate psychological first aid into their disaster response protocols, training volunteers to recognize the signs of trauma and to provide comfort and reassurance. The lessons from Jrell helped shape the way the nation responded to later disasters, from Hurricane Katrina to the Joplin tornado, ensuring that mental health was treated as an essential part of recovery, not an afterthought. The insurance industry also learned hard lessons from Jrell. The tornado was one of the costliest in Texas history at the time, causing over $40 million in damages. But the insurance companies soon realized that the true cost was much higher, because many of the homes in Double Creek estates had been underinsured. The homeowners had not anticipated the level of destruction, the total loss of property. They had policies that covered the value of the structure but not the cost of rebuilding to new codes, not the cost of debris removal, not the cost of temporary housing. Some families were left with nothing, forced to start over with no financial cushion. In the aftermath, insurance companies began to reassess their models. They developed new windstorm policies specifically for tornado-prone areas, policies that included coverage for replacement cost, for additional living expenses, for the installation of safe rooms. They also raised premiums in high-risk zones, a move that was controversial but that reflected the actuarial reality. The town of Jrell became a battleground for a national debate about insurance and risk. Some argued that the government should subsidize premiums for homeowners in Tornado Alley, that it was unfair to price them out of coverage. Others countered that the market was simply reflecting the true cost of living in a dangerous place. The debate continued for years with no easy answers, but the starting point was always the same. The Jarrell tornado had revealed the fragility of our financial safety nets. On a broader scale, the Jarrell tornado changed the way Americans thought about disaster preparedness. Before 1997, many people in Tornado Alley considered themselves invincible. They had been through close calls before, had seen the funnel clouds touch down and lift back up, had watched the storms pass harmlessly. They had a sense of familiarity, even complacency, about the risks. Jrell shattered that illusion. The tornado had been so violent, so relentless, that it was impossible to ignore. It was not just a story on the news. It was a warning that the worst could happen anywhere, anytime, without warning. In the years that followed, the number of households with a NOAA weather radio increased dramatically. Storm spotting classes filled up. Emergency management agencies across the country saw a surge in demand for tabletop exercises and community drills. The mantra of preparedness became a cultural touchstone. Have a plan, know your shelter, stay informed. The National Weather Service launched the Storm Ready program, which recognized communities that had taken steps to improve their preparedness. Jrell became one of the first storm-ready communities in Texas, a designation the town wore with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The story of Jrell also entered the realm of popular culture. Documentaries were made, books were written, and the tornado was featured in several television series about natural disasters. The Discovery Channel aired a special in 1998, and later, the Weather Channel produced a half-hour segment for its series Storm Stories, narrated by a somber voice that described the events in vivid detail. The footage of the Double Creek estates, the aerial shots of the scoured earth, became iconic images used in countless presentations about tornado safety. The phrase, the Jarrell tornado, entered the lexicon of severe weather enthusiasts who studied it with the same reverence that historians study Gettysburg or Pearl Harbor. On online forums, meteorologists would debate the exact wind speeds, the rating of the tornado, the nature of the damage. Some argued that it should have been rated an F6, a category that had never been officially used. Others pointed out that the enhanced Fujita scale, when it was implemented, still only went to EF5 and that the distinction was ultimately academic. The damage was beyond description, beyond classification. It was a testament to nature's power, a reminder that no scale could capture the full horror of what the people of Jrell had endured. But for all the scientific and cultural impact, the most important legacy of the Jarrell tornado was the quiet heroism of the survivors. They were not just victims, they were people who had stared into the abyss and chosen to rebuild. They had faced the worst possible outcome and had not broken. They had taken their grief and turned it into purpose. Some became advocates for storm safety, traveling to schools and community centers to tell their stories. They would stand on a stage, looking out at a room full of strangers, and speak of the day the sky turned green. They would describe the roar of the wind, the smell of the earth, the sight of their neighbors being pulled into the vortex. They would pause, breathe, and then talk about the safe room, the importance of heeding warnings, the need to be prepared. Their voices would shake, but they kept going. They did it because they believed that if they could save even one life, it would be worth the pain of reliving the worst day of their lives. And they did save lives. Time and again, after a tornado struck another town, a survivor would come forward and say that they had heard the story of Jrell, that they had built a safe room because of it, that they had taken shelter in time. The legacy of Jrell was written in the lives that were spared, in the families that huddled together in a concrete room while the world was destroyed around them. One such story comes from a woman named Margaret who lives in Kansas. In 2003, a tornado hit her town, a strong EF4 that ripped through a trailer park. Margaret had moved to Kansas from Texas, and she had always been afraid of storms. Her husband had built a safe room in their garage, a small concrete box with a steel door and a vent. The day the tornado came, Margaret was home alone. She heard the sirens, saw the sky turn a sickly yellow, and ran to the safe room. She had a weather radio, a flashlight, a pillow, and a bottle of water. She sat in the dark and listened to the roar as the tornado passed less than 100 feet from her house. She could feel the concrete shudder, could hear the sound of debris hitting the outside walls. She prayed even though she had not prayed in years. After it was over, she emerged to find her house still standing, but the trailer park down the street was gone. 8 people had died, but Margaret was alive. She later wrote a letter to the town of Jrell, addressed to the survivors. She said, "Thank you for teaching me the value of a safe room. Thank you for sharing your story. I am alive because of you." That letter is kept in the archives of the Jarrell Historical Society, a testament to the ripple effect of one community's tragedy. The ripple effect extended even to those who never set foot in Texas. In Japan, after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, emergency managers studied the Jarrell tornado as an example of how a small community could coordinate a response. In Australia, weather forecasters used the data from Jarrell to improve their warnings for severe thunderstorms. In Europe, where tornadoes are less common but still occur, meteorologists began to adopt the language of the Fujita scale, referencing Jrell as a benchmark of extreme damage. The story transcended boundaries of language and culture. It was a story about the power of nature, but also about the power of human resilience. It reminded people that no matter how advanced our technology, how precise our forecasts, there would always be a limit to our control. The atmosphere is a chaotic system, full of variables we cannot predict, forces we cannot contain. The best we can do is to prepare, to watch, to listen, and to take shelter when the warnings come. In Jrell itself, the anniversary of the tornado became a time of collective remembrance, but also a time of renewal. Each year on May 27th, the town would hold a ceremony at the memorial park. The sun would shine, the birds would sing, and the sky would be a perfect blue. It almost never rained on that day, as if the weather itself was showing respect. The survivors would gather, some of them now gray and stooped, others just children when the storm hit, now adults with children of their own. They would stand in a circle and listen as the names were read. They would place their hands on the granite obelisk, feeling the letters carved into the stone. They would hug, cry, and then share a potluck meal at the community center. There would be barbecue and iced tea and stories about the lives of the 27 who had been taken. They would laugh at memories of the dead, remembering a joke or a kindness, keeping them alive in the only way that was possible. And then the day would end and they would go home and life would go on. The long arc of recovery is not always linear. There were setbacks, moments when the grief returned with unexpected force. A new family would move into the rebuilt Double Creek estates and the old-timers would watch them unpack, wondering if they knew the history. Sometimes they would go over and introduce themselves, offering a warning, a piece of advice. It was not always well received. Some newcomers resented the constant reminders of death. They wanted to live in the present, not in the shadow of a tragedy that did not belong to them. The tension between honoring the past and moving forward is a theme that runs through every town that has suffered a disaster. Jrell was no different. The survivors had to learn that their story was not everyone's story, that the new neighbors had their own fears and hopes. They had to let go of the need to protect others, to control the narrative. They had to trust that the lessons had been learned, that the safe rooms would be built, that the warnings would be heeded, even if no one said it out loud. In the end, the Jarrell tornado is not just a story of destruction, it is a story of transformation. It changed the way we understand tornadoes, the way we build our homes, the way we warn each other. It changed the lives of everyone who lived through it, binding them together in a way that only shared trauma can. It gave them a purpose, a mission to prevent future loss. And it gave the rest of us a cautionary tale, a reminder that the world is beautiful and terrible, that we are small and vulnerable, and that the only thing we can do is to hold on to each other and prepare for the worst. The sky will turn green again. the sirens will sound. But the people of Jrell and the millions who have heard their story will be ready. They will seek shelter, they will survive, and they will remember. That is the story of May 27, 1997. That is the legacy of the Jarrell Tornado. It is a story that does not end because it is written into the lives of everyone it touched and into the fabric of a nation that learned from its tragedy. The tornado is gone, but its lessons remain. The names on the memorial are still read each year. Safe rooms are still being built, the warnings are still being issued, and the people of Jrell, scarred and resilient, continue to live their lives under a Texas sky that can turn violent in an instant. They know the risk, they have faced the worst, and they have chosen to stay, to build, to remember, and to hope. That is the final truth of the Jarrell Tornado, that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, the human spirit endures. And that is the story that will be told for generations to come. And yet the story does not simply rest in memory or in the pages of history books. It continues to evolve, shaped by new discoveries and by the quiet courage of those who carry its weight. In the years that followed, scientists delved deeper into the data collected from that day. They analyzed the debris scar, the radar signatures, the wind patterns that created such a rare and violent storm. The Jarrell Tornado became a case study for a phenomenon now called a subvortex, a smaller, even more intense rotation that can form within the main funnel. This was not a single twister but a family of vortices, each one capable of scouring the ground with forces beyond the standard Fujita scale. The damage indicators were so extreme that engineers had to develop a new classification, EF5, the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, and Jrell was one of the key benchmarks. The town's tragedy helped refine the very language we use to describe tornadoes, giving future forecasters a clearer picture of what an unstoppable storm looks like. But the science was only one part of the legacy. The human story continued to unfold in unexpected ways. In 2005, a young man named David, who had lost his parents in the tornado, returned to Jrell after serving in the military. He had been just 3 years old when the storm hit, raised by his grandmother in another state. He had only fragments of memory, the sound of his mother's voice, the smell of rain-soaked carpet. When he came back, he walked the streets of Double Creek Estates, now lush with new homes and trees. He visited the memorial and found his parents' names carved in granite. He knelt and touched the letters, feeling the cool stone under his fingers. He stayed for hours until the sun set and the sky turned a deep purple. A local woman, a survivor, saw him and approached. She recognized the grief in his posture. She sat beside him and told him stories of his parents, how his father had coached Little League, how his mother had baked pies for every community potluck. David listened, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt a connection to the place that had taken his family. He decided to stay. He bought a house in Jrell, married a woman from nearby Georgetown, and raised his own children there. When asked why he would return to the site of such loss, he said, "Because this is home. The tornado did not win. My parents loved this place and I want to honor that by living here." Stories like David's are not rare. They are the quiet tapestry of Jrell's continued existence. The town itself grew slowly at first, then more rapidly as the Austin metropolitan area expanded. New subdivisions were built, new schools opened, and the population swelled from a few thousand to over 10,000 by the 2010s. Many of the newcomers had never heard of the tornado. They came for affordable housing and good schools. But the old-timers made sure the story was told. The Jrell Independent School District incorporated tornado safety into its curriculum, teaching children from kindergarten onward about the importance of drills, of having a plan, of understanding the warning signs. Every year on the anniversary, the high school would hold a moment of silence. Students who had lost grandparents or aunts or uncles would stand in front of the assembly and share a memory. It became a rite of passage, a way to keep the past alive without letting it paralyze the future. The ripple effect also reached into the world of emergency management. In 2018, a team of researchers from the University of Oklahoma published a study that examined the long-term psychological impact of the Jarrell tornado. They interviewed survivors who had been children at the time, now in their 20s and 30s. They found that many had developed a heightened vigilance and almost hyper-awareness of the sky. They could not sit through a thunderstorm without checking the radar. They could not sleep if the wind picked up, but they also found something unexpected, a deep resilience. These survivors had channeled their anxiety into action. Some became meteorologists, others became storm chasers, a few became counselors specializing in trauma. One woman, who had been 8 years old and hiding in a closet while her mother was pulled away, became a school principal. She designed her school's emergency plan and personally led tornado drills twice a year. She made sure that every classroom had a safe space, that every teacher knew how to shield children from flying glass, that every student had a parent's phone number memorized. She said, "I can't change what happened to me, but I can make sure it never happens to my students." The story of Jrell also influenced how the National Weather Service communicates warnings. After the tornado, there was a push to make warnings more specific, more urgent. The phrase, "This is a particularly dangerous situation," became standard for the most extreme events. The NWS began issuing tornado emergencies, a higher level of alert that is reserved for storms that are confirmed to be producing catastrophic damage. The system that we have today, with its polygon warnings and its detailed impact statements, owes a debt to the lessons learned in Jrell. The 27 people who died did not die in vain. Their loss helped save countless others who never knew their names. And so the story continues, writ large across maps of risk, across building codes, across the minds of every person who has ever looked up at a green sky and felt their heart quicken. The people of Jrell do not see themselves as heroes. They are simply people who lived through a terrible day and decided to keep living. They built a memorial, yes. They hold ceremonies, yes. But they also go to work, tend their gardens, raise their children, and laugh at birthday parties. They have not let the tornado define them. They have integrated it into their identity, but they have not become prisoners of it. Perhaps that is the most profound lesson of all. The human spirit is not measured by the absence of suffering, but by the ability to absorb it and still find meaning. The people of Jrell proved that even after the worst day of your life, you can wake up the next morning and choose to stay. You can rebuild. You can plant a tree where a cypress tree once stood. You can fall in love again. You can teach your grandchildren what it means to be brave. The sky will turn green again. The sirens will sound. But the story of Jrell will echo in the hearts of all who hear it, a quiet reminder that we are stronger together, that we are capable of incredible resilience, and that even in the face of the most violent storm, the human spirit endures. That is the final truth. That is the legacy of May 27, 1997. And that is the story that will be told for generations to come, not as a tale of despair, but as a testament to the power of hope, of memory, and of the unbreakable bond between a people and their home.